and to resist the absolute tyranny established by the lawless imperialism of Washington, D.C., and to remember the struggle against the religious mass murder and inquisition designed by the Roman papacy. So we're back again with the Lookingglassforum. We're doing another episode for you. And we have to get back to the drawing board and get back to basics and try to learn the truth about how we're losing our country and how the foundational principles, the pillars upon which American independence and political liberty and individual freedom are being eroded. And so as we see the gradual managed decline of Western society, of American democracy, you can see that this is a large-scale globalist operation that is seeking to tear apart and atomize the American people and break apart the different institutions of our democracy so that we can no longer rely on the media, on organized authorities, on the government itself. And we're in a position now where if we want to see our nation survive as the bastion of freedom and independence and constitutional, democratic, and popular government, we have to discover and have the courage to come to the conclusion that it's the government itself in Washington, D.C. that is our main problem. And it is also a problem for the people around the world. And you can see that the moral depravity of those who we would say are our leaders in government. I mean, even look at the family of the president, Joe Biden there. They're still starting investigations into Hunter Biden, and this guy is a crackhead, and he's some kind of pedophile. He's got some kind of horrible pornography addiction. And the other intelligence agencies that have been following this guy around his entire life, I imagine, and who helped him lose his laptop and helped provide him with different kinds of prostitutes, are going to be using and capturing all this information to use against him now. And so we're at a point now where when I look at the headlines, it looks like in the Xi'an district in China, looks like there's mass starvation, according to Breitbart and some other news outlets. And of course, these are the news outlets who are going to have the courage and the conviction of their own principles to actually report this information. You can imagine that, these other political media outlets, the corporate media, they're not going to report any of this. They're not going to say anything to upset their Chinese partners. And so if you look in Canada, it looks like that the lockdowns have become so strict that you can't even leave your home to walk your dog. So I'm trying to understand how people could allow themselves to be imprisoned into their own homes by their government. And you must recognize that Canada is just a Commonwealth nation that belongs to Britain, it belongs to the United Kingdom or England, how many names does this place have? But of course, you know that those are all just the attributes of the city of London. And so ultimately, even Australia, same thing. People are coming and carting the people away and beating them up and hauling them into prison or, internment camps or quarantine facilities. I mean, it doesn't matter what you name it. It's the same thing. It's just a new Bastille dungeon. And they throw you in there because you're not going along with what they tell you. So now more than ever, it's important for Americans to understand the revolution. This is different than any other revolution in the world. And maybe the word revolution isn't correct because we can't categorize the American fight for freedom with what happened to the butchery and to the sad, tragic slaughter that happened in Russia, what they call the Russian Revolution, or with the Bolsheviks, or what happened with the French Revolution, with the Jacobins. There's always some kind of occult group of provocateurs in the background, the Jacobins or the Bolsheviks, or, they always roll in some kind of Antifa, some kind of group that is there to kick off the revolutionary agenda of the high contracting powers, right? It's what it always comes down to. It comes down to maintaining the status quo of the power structure. So when we look at the American revolt, when the Americans no longer would take any more of the tyranny or the subjugation that was coming from London, and of course, this in 1776, this is a really crucial time because this is an exact moment in history when the Jesuit order was extinguished. So that's going to take place in 1773. And according to the writings of Thomas Jefferson and other individuals, George Washington, other individuals that were contemporary at the time, they were very aware of the power and influence of the Jesuit order, and they were very aware that it was temporarily put out of commission. And so this was a crucial time to take advantage of that moment in history to revolt against the power of the British Navy, the Army, the influence of London around the world. So I think that it's crucial to recognize that on some level, the George Washington, these were men who were praying men, these were Puritans and Quakers and intellectuals who were fleeing to the colonies and to North America for political liberty, to find freedom, to be left alone, to be left to their own personal freedom. And so this idea of American freemen was going to be born at that time. And so as far as they knew, this fight against the tyranny and the overwhelming force of the oligarchy and the imperialism that was coming out of London was academic. On some level, it was just a demonstration. They had no guarantee that they were going to win and survive and overcome. They prayed, I'm sure they prayed desperately to God for victory. And, if you go back and look at the history in Valley Forge, this was a terribly pathetic and dire situation for these men to be in order to bring about this perhaps merely illustrative fight against tyranny, a fight that they had no means ultimately to accomplish, and it became a desperate race across the continent for the gunpowder, of course, but these men had no idea if they were going to win or not, and they were ultimately putting up a fight based on the principle of standing against the bully, of standing against the monstrous and unaccountable and arbitrary power of the monarch. Of course, there had been monarchs in England in the past. For instance, if you look at Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant queen, a queen who allowed her subjects to have religious independence from Roman religion, which was new. You can imagine at the time, all the other kingdoms and monarchs of Europe did not allow their subjects to worship the way that they saw fit, according to the dictates of their conscience. You either were going to accept and participate in the Roman religion, and on the feast days and the holidays and on the particular arbitrary whims of the priests, or you were going to get referred to the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was there to root out all heresy, or anybody who was an outlier or a dissident, or anyone who thought that they could approach God on their own without the cathedral and the priests and the ritual. Any man who thought he would stay home at Mass and read his own Bible and pray to God alone was a heretic and would just be rooted out. And so you can see that the horrible and horrific abuse of the Roman religion at the time throughout Spain and Portugal and France and Italy and England and throughout everywhere. The entire known world was submitted to the power of the Pope in Rome. And that was it. And if you had a problem with it, if you spoke against it, if you even dared to possess a single page of the Bible, like we've said in many episodes before, you were subject to being arrested, thrown in the dungeon, and then subjected to the third degree of inquisition, of inquiry. And of course, at first they would show you, and this is for people who don't know the facts of history, don't know the reality of life just a few short decades and centuries ago. You got to remember the Inquisition was ended in 1803. It wasn't very long after where slavery was ended in France and in England. And of course, you can see that there was political reasons for that, because in many ways, slavery and the Inquisition never really went away. They just changed forms and changed shape. But the forces of imperialism that supported slavery and the Inquisition both are still in place today. So you can see that this fight for freedom in America is essential and it's fundamental, so that you can't separate American liberty and the political liberty that was won by the patriots and the founding fathers of this country from the freedom of conscience that was established by the Protestant Reformation. So that means that America itself is an effect and a consequence of the Protestant Reformation that began in 1517. So an individual named Martin Luther, and of course, Martin Luther was a man of his time. He was a Roman Catholic monk who could read Latin and he could read Greek. He was educated. He was one of the elite of the time. He was one of the top 1%, the most educated individuals in Europe. And he came in contact with the scriptures so that he would read the New Testament, and he was one of very few men to do it. And the consequences of reading the New Testament were for him to recognize that the religion of Rome, Roman religion, Romanism itself was not Christianity. Again, it was not Christianity. So today, people are really confused by this complexity. There's a whole occult shadow that blinds Americans to this particular subject matter, to the details of the history of it, and so they can't determine what it is to be an American freeman and what constitutional liberties and the Bill of Rights and the protections that were afforded, what they mean. And we've discussed it in other episodes, but the entire apparatus and the entire foundation of constitutional protections and individual liberties that were established in this country was so revolutionary and so life-changing and game-changing that the imperial and elite powers of Europe sought forever to find a way to destroy it. So the American Revolution was fought, and when the British, the Redcoats, could no longer maintain hegemony across the ocean. They had different conflicts around the world. They had conflicts with the Tsar. In Russia, they had different conflicts all around the world, and they could no longer maintain their military supply lines to defend the colonies in North America. And so that window of opportunity that allowed Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and all these other men to set up national sovereignty for what had been British colonies, the several 13 colonies, if you want, were now going to become nation states. And in order to run these nation states, in order to establish government in these nation states, they would set up a democracy, a republican democracy. So the distinction of that is that a democracy is just the majority always wins, and in a democratic republic, the minority is protected also. So you as an individual in America, you're a minority. You're a minority of one, and your individual, your liberties and your rights are protected, and that's how it had been. And so as we're moving forward, we need to understand that we have to return once again to this de jure constitutional republic. And it's not such an easy thing to do, and we have labored with hours of information and episodes to illuminate the minds of the public and to elucidate the wider populace with this information that's hard to come by, because in today's day and age, it's all about Apple iPhones and DoorDash. So the entire enterprise of American national sovereignty is being systematically broken down, and the people who are responsible for maintaining their liberties and their independence here in the United States are becoming increasingly indebted to the massive spending, the borrowing of this pseudo-national government. And they're not only interested in collapsing the currency and the Federal Reserve note itself, but they're bringing into subjugation all the debtors who borrowed that bank credit to begin with. So we went off the gold standard and we had no more value and we were broke, so we began to borrow. The federal government, the national government, began to borrow large amounts of bank credit from the international banking conglomerates who, in order to make a receipt of that debt, printed out the debt notes, the Federal Reserve notes, and we passed them around. We bought and sold goods and services from each other. We paid our bills with Federal Reserve notes, and we were ultimately, by the full faith and credit of the American people, that's you and me, we were brought into debt in order to borrow this financial resource, because the Federal Reserve note is a private banking instrument, and we had to borrow more and more. And that's why that if you look up our national debt clock and look at it, we can see that even your kids at this point, probably you and your spouse and your kids, if you have any, are all owe the federal debt and to the tune of maybe $100,000 each. And I never can keep up because it's always going up. So you are personally responsible for the bank debt that your national government is racking up in your name. And that's through the representatives that you sent to Washington, D.C. So this whole issue of how the elections are working out, are these elections valid? Are these Dominion voting systems? Are they transparent, or are they just systems of cheating? Are they systems of fraudulent control? Systems of control that the American people are no longer in control of their government. So this idea of the walking dead, that's you. That's you being vaccinated to death and indebted to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. And like I said, the word dollar is another deception. It's not a dollar, it's a Federal Reserve note, and it's just as deceptive as your coins. If you reach in your pocket and you look at your coins, your nickels, your dimes, and your quarters, those are supposed to be silver. They're supposed to represent silver coins by a certain weight. A dime and a quarter, they're weights of silver value, but of course, they're no longer silver. So it wasn't very long after the time of the Kennedy era when coins are just cadmium zinc blanks, and they might have a little bit of silver plating. You get silver-plated money. That represents you. That represents your whole country. That represents your entire situation that you're in. You reach into your pocket, you're scrounging around, and you know if you leave it out, it just begins to rot and it begins to corrode and rust away, because silver doesn't rust away, and proper copper pennies don't rust away and get all smelly and start to smell like some kind of they get some kind of white corrosive powder on it as it begins to just break down. It's not copper and it's not silver, and it's really not valuable. So it's a lie. Your money is a lie. Your whole situation is a lie, and you don't have any information. You have the entire apparatus of the news media lying to you and deceiving you and telling you the wrong thing to do and leading you in the wrong direction. And you can't decipher or discern the nature of the conflict that you're in, because this is the American Revolution. It never changed. It never stopped. The war never ended. It kept going, generation after generation, and it became an information war to dumb down your children. And it became a pharmaceutical struggle to poison your body with medicine that you don't need. And you don't have any kind of language or jargon or any kind of standing to describe the struggle or to understand it or comprehend it. You have no vocabulary for this. And now when you go to the voting machine and you put the button and you try to pick your government, your voting machine is cheating, and it's just going to give you the government that it wants to give you. And so now we have to look at the real issue at hand is cowards. Fearful, loathsome, creeping cowards is what we become. And we're supposed to be a nation of free men, strong, land of the free and the brave, and all this. This is the propaganda we're supposed to believe. But unless you individually are going to take a stand and stand up for these founding principles that America was established with, then I think that you're going to watch your country dissolve like sand through your fingers. And this is what the legacy you'll have to give your kids and your posterity will have you to thank for being too ignorant, too sick, too deceived. And you have graduates in high school who are illiterate. This is a fact. They just move them right along. Graduate, you put your little hat on, you give you the little scroll of certificate of graduation, but you can't read, you can't do any calculus, you can't think. You have been destroyed. And you have to remember that back under Roman law, it was illegal for a slave to be able to read. I'm sure that was practical, a practical principle for making sure that the slaves remained enslaved. And now you have institutes of education that are pumping out kids who know how to get on food stamps and how to have baby daddies, but they don't know how to read. And so this is the difficulty that we're having, that we're going to continue to have, that the apparatus of our government has been weaponized against us. And we're the parties that are responsible for this cascading debt spiral, and all we have to show for it are social security numbers and food stamp cards and Obama phones. And we no longer have any ability to understand what the nature of the original struggle was. And that was courageous men who would rather lay down their lives and die than live as slaves. Give me liberty or give me death. There was no in between. There wasn't this quasi, I'll go to the quarantine prison and I'm afraid of the crown virus. We've been doing our best to show everyone who will listen, anyone who will pay attention, the truth that there is a correlation, a nexus point between the CCP in Wuhan and this apparatus coming out of London. The university's there. And then as we'll look, if we get time, we'll work hard to put in the information into these episodes. But it looks like that Pfizer, if you go back in 2004, 2006 period, looks like Pfizer had a laboratory in Wuhan too. And of course, those different memos are taken down now, so that as I repeat it, you can't go look on Pfizer's websites and see the bulletins and the memos regarding the Wuhan lab facilities they have there. But you can see that there's a larger global contingency, a global government that's being established that has to destroy national sovereignty, starting with America. And so that's what you're dealing with. And so I can understand everyone's frustrated about, the election is rigged, the election system is rigged. You know what you better do is you better go down there and vote. And you better go down there and vote 3 times. If that's what they're doing, then we better do it too. If we just lay down and die at this point, we're just handing over the whole thing to our enemies. We're opening up the gates to our adversaries. So these are our elections, yours and mine, and we don't have any reason to give up our democratic institution and our ballot because somebody is screwing with it. Then we have every reason to go down there and enforce our vote and the will of our ballot onto the government. So this is exhausting. I don't know about you, but I've been just completely exhausted and run down by this particular struggle, watching the different countries of the world, Germany and Austria, just fall to this globalist vanguard. And that's the most difficult thing about this whole thing, is that no one really has anywhere to turn. They don't know where to look. They don't have an enemy that they can see, who they can identify. And so this particular particular occult enemy, this invisible enemy, the invisible committee, if you will, like we discussed, is beginning to manage the global plantation. So that's why people don't need to be sent off to prisons. They can just be imprisoned in their homes. And so I think that we're becoming biological property. We're becoming human resources, human assets to be dissolved and destroyed or deployed or to be propagandized anyway in whatever way the global establishment sees fit. So these are my concerns. So we're opening up the episode. So I want to introduce some different articles and some different information, some various speakers and authors as we do in the show. And I'm here just to encourage you, to remind you that your life is not so precious and your heartbeat and your breath isn't so necessary that you should just be willing to bow down and live as a slave. You should be prepared to show your kids and your grandkids and the people that come after you what courage is. That you and men and women like you were willing to put it all on the line in order to maintain their freedoms and their liberties. It reminds me of the movie 300 with Sparta. This is Sparta. And so these were men who it was their purpose in life to die in defense of their way of life and their freedoms, and that's what it's going to require here. That's what's going to become necessary now. This is a war of attrition. That's a fight for all the marbles. And if you're not willing to give up your smartphone or the internet, you're not willing to give up conveniences on your Facebook apps and so on and so forth, the addiction of these social media tech giants, they're just absorbing and sucking the soul out of your body. They're taking your energy and turning it into profits as you spend all day flicking through the posts. They earn money. They actually earned their dividend, billions and billions of dollars, based on how much time you spend looking at their platform. So you're empowering it. You're empowering these Twitter, Facebook, Google, the whole Amazon, the whole structure itself. You're putting your power into it, and then all of a sudden the sun goes down, and you look around, and your day is gone, and you spent all the time you could have been like doing a garden, because a garden's a practical thing. You might need food someday. You could have been down at your gun shop getting some new ammo. You could have been spending time with your kids. You could have been doing anything with your time, but you burned up your life energy and the light of your soul. You poured it into an application on your phone that basically just watches you everywhere you go. All those apps you have on your phone, TikTok and all that, they can see everywhere you go. They have access to your microphone. They can hear what you're doing. Not just one, but Apple, TikTok, Twitter, all of them. So you have one device that has 700 different tech companies watching everything you do. And you're just letting it happen. So in the end, whatever happens to your kids and you and with the vaccines and the health crisis and what is necessary is here at home that you have the courage of your convictions and you're willing to take a stand so that your kids can see you fight for freedom and maybe give up your life for freedom. And they can hold that and internalize that within themselves. This is what it's all about. If our young people, our next generation, our millennials watch us get on our knees and bow and scrape, then that's going to be the example for all time. That's going to be the George Washington of our era. Did George Washington get down off his horse and get down on his knee and give up his sword and get hung by the British? No, that's not the example that we have. And that's not the example you should be to your kids either. So this is a fight. This is an existential fight. It doesn't matter if you survive it or not. What matters is, will you take a stand for American liberty to bring back the Constitution? Because as we already pointed out in other episodes, maybe you didn't have the time. You're too busy like flipping through Facebook. You didn't have time to go hear any alternate ideas. But the coup d'etat that took place in March 1933 that allowed the federal government, the national government, and specifically the commander-in-chief as an absolute imperator over all other authorities, was imposed upon the American people with executive orders. And executive orders have been in place since the 1860s with Abraham Lincoln. Those executive orders are unconstitutional. They were used to make unconstitutional laws. They were used as a prerogative of the executive branch to create laws and to fight wars and to do things that the executive branch doesn't have any power to do. So those illegal executive orders were utilized in March 1933 to create the empire of America that we have now. That's why these state governments are struggling. Texas and Florida and other places are struggling. The governors are struggling to maintain their own sovereignty and the rulership over their states and to be able to govern their states in spite of the encroachments of the federal government. The federal government in Washington, D.C. is a problem. It's a problem that we're not going to be able to hide from. It's a problem that we're not going to be able to just ignore. A lot of us are hiding up in our homes, clutching our wives and our children, hiding in our homes because we're too afraid to come out, to get with one another, to form militias or to form political action groups or to form an avenue by which we can deal with our federal government. You're hiding in your homes. It's time for you to come out, to see other men who are willing to stand up for their liberties and stand up for their country and to form a new government. That's what we got to do. And this whole discussion, me broadcasting this podcast, you listening to it, we're on a list. We're on a list. And so why? Who cares? If you go back and look, the federal government wanted to have an FBI file open on every single American citizen that was alive. And this was a program that was started under J. Edgar Hoover. Under J. Edgar Hoover, they wanted to have an FBI file on every single American. You're going back to the 50s. So where are we at now? Where are we at now, guys? Where are we at with this federal deep state oligarchy out of Washington, D.C.? They know you. They know that they got you cowered in your homes. They got you shut up. You're too afraid to speak out. Because if you go on your device and you text a message to someone else, they'll know. This is a technocracy, and it's an absolute tyranny. And it's something that you have to resist, even if it kills you. Because if you submit to absolute tyranny, it's a sin. That's exactly what Benjamin Franklin was pointing out. You have a duty to stand up against tyranny. The tyranny is going to come and kill you regardless. You have a duty as a man and a woman to stand up against tyranny and to face up against it, and to speak that truth against it, and to take actions to prepare for a long, protracted struggle against your government who is coming to destroy you. So before we go too long on this, let me just introduce a fascinating article here. We just have to listen to it. Victor Davis Hanson.
I tried to write The Dying Citizen with the idea of some historical or cultural history and background, and then contemporary examples that reflect those trends, those long-standing trends. But I had no idea that when I finished the book, that we would see this disaster at the border, or General Milley, or what's happened in Afghanistan, or critical race theory to the same degree. So it was sort of, I like to think it was prescient. But I'll give you an example of what you're talking about. General Milley is not elected, but in the space of about 10 days, we learned that he called his Chinese communist counterpart and basically suggested he would tip them off if he thought Trump would do some sort of preemptive action. And then he said democracy is messy. I think the Chinese love to hear that. And then he also said later, when asked under oath, well, he didn't really believe that Trump was deranged or non-compos mentis. And then he interrupted the chain of command concerning nuclear protocols, even though the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is forbidden by statute of interfering in the chain of command. Then we heard that he violated Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice by disparaging his commander-in-chief, not retired, but an active military officer, when he told a couple of journalists that Donald Trump was Hitlerian or reminded him of Mein Kampf. He hasn't denied that. And then we go to Dr. Fauci, and he still cannot explain to us. He tries, but the more he denies, the more ridiculous he seems, that he channeled $600,000 through Echo Health. It's sort of like the fox in the chicken house when it was auditing itself to tell Americans that there was no problem here. But nevertheless, he channeled it through Echo Health, who then gave that money to Ground Zero Virology Lab in Wuhan, which we now know is the source of the virus. And I don't even get into Hunter Biden or Bill Gates, what they've said about China. So we have this class of people. Hunter Biden wasn't elected to anything. I don't know how he rides on Air Force Two when Joe Biden was vice president, or how he navigates with his sort of latest art project, or General Milley was not elected, Anthony Fauci was not elected. But they all seem to exercise judicial, executive, and legislative powers, and then they all have this, for all their ecumenicalism and globalism, they seem to be completely blind to the atrocity that's the modern Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, and I definitely want to talk a little bit about how the CCP has kind of leveraged all this in a little bit. But I'm very, very fascinated in this, I guess, intersection of the administrative state and basically the critical social justice movement. It almost seems like the whole ideology and the movement that's sort of inseparable from it, they're kind of almost like tailor-made for a large bureaucracy to enact.
Yeah, I think so. And I kept quoting examples from the McCarthy period, or what George Orwell wrote in animal farm or 1984. But you get the impression that when you have 2 million federal employees and you have a couple of thousand degree PhDs or MBAs or JDs in the New York, Washington nexus, and they tend to be almost organic. In other words, that anybody who feeds this unaccountable amoeba, then they like, and they enlist, whether it's James Comey or John Brennan or Kevin Klein-Smith, whoever they are, they feel they're exempt from all audit. And they're exercising an enormous amount of powers, and you can really see it just recently when we see that Merrick Garland suggested that the FBI would look into legitimate protest of parents over critical racial theory, or that, and he said that at a time when it's a federal crime to harass a U.S. senator. We had a U.S. senator in a bathroom who was harangued and actually filmed, which is also a felony in the state of Arizona where it took place, Senator Sinema. And then she was harassed on a federal monitored flight, which is also illegal, when the same protester came up and sort of yelled at her. And yet the FBI was completely uninterested. I think what people are most afraid of is they're just now discovering that the IRS, and we see now they're going to be able to have access to accounts without a warrant if there's $600 withdrawn in cash. They're just starting to see that in this electronic age, the age-old worry about an administrative state has now become critical because they have the technological electronic means of instantaneous connection, communication, and power. And whether it's the IRS or what we've seen of James Comey's FBI or John Brennan's CIA or General Milley's Pentagon, they all have one thing in common. They seem to have nothing but disgust for the average citizen. Sometimes they call, they reference white rage. Sometimes in the case of Joe Biden, they say, harassing a senator is just part of the process, or he's used the word chumps and dregs to refer to the middle classes. We had the clingers of Barack Obama. We had the deplorables of Hillary Clinton. But it doesn't cease. It just continues as if there's no downside, either rhetorically or materially attacking people who suggest any doubt about the legitimacy or the efficacy of these federal governments.
So that was Victor Davis Hanson on American Thought Leaders. And he's really trying to articulate what the problem is here. It's a complicated issue, and you don't win any prizes, or nobody gives you a medal for coming out and speaking the truth about these consequential issues. And we're really in a struggle against a government who is becoming so tyrannical with such horrifying overreach that the consequences for resisting and for speaking out and for being a dissident are catastrophic. People are losing their jobs everywhere. It's a slow process, like Mao Zedong's struggle sessions during the revolution in 1949. It's a slow process of breaking people down, on creating a peer culture that's intolerant and basically picks itself apart. So there's no police, coming in. It's just the society and the actual social network itself that begins to weed out all those who are not marching in lockstep. And so you can see that it's a process of breaking down every wall of separation, every boundary that keeps the federal monstrosity in check. It keeps it inside limitations and boundaries. And you can see here, as we're looking through the different news articles, a judge blocks a COVID vaccine mandate for the Head Start program that would require teachers and others to be vaccinated. So the federal government is not interested in protecting the American people from cartel drug shipments of fentanyl over our border. They're not interested in making sure that the Americans who are in Afghanistan right now today, they're not interested in making sure that they ever get home again. They're only interested in making sure that everyone here, every civvy inside the civil society of America, is forced to take this experimental mRNA substance. And the difficulty that we're facing is that the vocabulary and the intellectual construct surrounding this whole pandemic is illusory. There is an asymmetrical conflict, an undisclosed assault on democracy and principles of popular Republican government around the world. So that this isn't really about vaccines or medicines or viruses. It's about introducing the tip of the spear by which a totalitarian global regime will begin to dictate to the rest of the world how life is going to be and what will and will not happen. And you can see that if you look over here in Amsterdam, they're beating the protesters. These are anti-lockdown protesters who are just interested in getting back to life as normal. They want to go out and go be able to shop, open up their businesses, go and get food for their refrigerators. And the police are going to go out with batons and attack dogs in Amsterdam and beat the people half to death. And they have pictures here showing that the attack dogs are biting the hell out of the anti-lockdown protesters. So you can see that this is not about getting people to take a vaccine or to believe in a medicine or to believe that the vaccine is good for you. The government's trying to help you. This is about absolute totalitarian control. And not on a national level. This is internationalism. This is global dictatorship. So that everywhere you go, doesn't matter if it's in Zimbabwe or in Australia or Amsterdam or everywhere you go in the world, you have to accept these lockdown directives. These are directives. These aren't like votes from a Congress who deliberate and who make the best law for the people, and the people hold the representatives accountable. This is just dictation. This is just the elitists, the Klaus Schwabs, and the World Economic Forum, and the masters of globalism in the background who are just going to dictate to all the serfs and everyone else how it's going to be. And part of the reason that they're able to do this is because the rest of the world has been borrowing massive sums of bank credit from these same elite individuals. And we're bankrupt. We're broke. We've entered a period of total bankruptcy. We're now borrowing trillions and trillions of dollars. And is anywhere else in the world any better? Is Amsterdam any more solvent than we are? Absolutely not. So as we're defaulting and as our banking credit and the debt that we owe to pay back this borrowed money is becoming colossal, and it's becoming unrecoverable to the point that our children and our grandchildren are not going to be able to earn enough wealth to pay it back. It means that we're in hock to them. Okay, we're the collateral. We borrowed all that banking resources from these private companies in the banks of England and in the City of London banking establishment, and the compounding fractional debt reserve banking calculus that they do shows that we can't pay back our debt. So that's why they're able to manage their newly acquired human resources around the world. They're able to tell people this is how it's going to be. And they find the right police forces that go around and just beat the people on the head with batons and have them. I mean, how soulless and empty and heartless are these police forces who are just going to go out and they're not going to say, well, we're not going to do this tyranny to these people. We're not going to be the instruments of totalitarian brutality against the populace at large. We're going to side with the populace and we're going to stand up against this technocratic dictatorship. But they won't do it. So it's the same thing that happened in Hitler's Germany. They had to find the right guards, the right SS, Gestapo individuals, and have them spun up with propaganda and have them radicalized to the extreme, so that they would view enemies of the state with the most reckless hatred, so that they would put them on, trains to Auschwitz so they could be destroyed without any conscience, because they had to, Heil Hitler, they had to do what the Führer says, right? There was no questioning it. And so it becomes a pathology, it becomes a psychosis. And if you listen to the ideas of Dr. Malone, this is mass formation psychosis. That's why people all around the world can't find a way to uncouple their minds from the propaganda. They can't find a way to question what's happening. They have to participate and they have to submit slavishly to the dictates of the elite. And so we have to recognize that we're facing a monumental struggle here in the West, here in America, especially the West. I mean, who's that? Who else is the West? Canada is not the West. They just bent over and spread them. They can't even walk their dogs. They're not allowed. It's like the principal came out and gave you detention, and you're not allowed. You've been told by your masters above you, you're not allowed to walk your dog. And then if you go look in the Xi'an district, if you look at the reporting that's coming out of there, these people are only allowed to come out of their homes twice a week to get food. And because of all the panic buying and the panic shopping that's happening, the shelves are empty, and they're not capitalist markets anyway, so I don't even know how they get their food in the first place. So they're facing mass starvation. So how does that work for the depopulation agenda? So in order to save the people and to medicate them and to give them vaccines for their good, the consequences of all those policies they're now starving to death. It reminds me of what happened with Stalin and the kulaks in Russia. They just starved 60 million people. It only takes 4 days. In 4 days, if you don't have any food, you're done. So if you're not awake yet, then God help you. You're not an American, and you're not a man, and you're not a woman, okay? You don't belong to this legacy of independence and freedom, a tradition of American strength and honor that is a result of our fight against tyranny. That's what America is. If you're too lazy for that, and if it just interrupts your schedule and you want to get to your comfy bed, then liberty and independence and freedom is not for you. You just need a totalitarian government to come in and starve you if it wants, or vaccinate you, or just tell you what to do, or line you up against the wall. That's the government for you. But freedom requires people to make the big sacrifice, the individual, personal self-sacrifice. That's what America's about. And maybe you're not up for it, and I get that. A lot of people aren't. But don't later on expect that the federal government's supposed to protect your rights. You know who's supposed to protect your rights? You are. That's why you were given the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is so that you can have gunpowder and privately owned firearms so that you can protect your own rights. So you don't let the people come out and take your guns and take your weapons and tell you and take away your constitutional liberties. Or you need to be able to stand up for that. And this isn't a time for extremists. This is a time for the terrible realities that we're being faced with, because those same imperial powers and monarchs and the thrones of Europe have not forgotten, and their children have not forgotten, and their dream of absolute totalitarianism and serfdom around the world hasn't gone away. And if you're not prepared to put it all on the line and to be an example to your children and neighbors of how to be an American freeman, you're going to sheepishly go away and hide in your home and take your vaccine, and the government tells you can come out of your home for twice a week to get food. You're just going to go along with it. If that's you, you're a pathetic shame. I mean, God help the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the revolutionaries who had to give up their lives and sacrifice the best years of their life trying to get gunpowder to shoot the British redcoats so that you, in the future, could be on Twitter and eat donuts and take vaccines and cower in your homes. And your children watch you cower. And this is the problem. You're going to be an example of cowardice to future generations instead of bravery and courage. So we're not going to go forward in some kind of future world with brain implants and missions to Mars and just leave the Constitution behind. That's not how this works. Those protections and those liberties and those restrictions on the national government, on the federal government, enumerated powers and limitations, those are permanent. And when that government comes out of its box and violates those restraints, then our obligations to that government are broken. Not by us, but by the apparatus and by the tyrannical governing body that's in Washington, D.C. Who no longer wants to have Congress approve war. Just wants to make an executive order and go to war and blow people up. It no longer wants to have limitations that protect the American people against it. It just wants to go at the American people and round them up and put them in camps. And if you and I and all the other individuals and patriots here in America can't get our act together, that monstrous beast, that tyrannical empire in Washington, D.C. is going to run roughshod over us and our kids. It's a terrible time to have a young kid, because you don't know what kind of future that child's going to have. You don't know if you're going to be around to support them later on. The government's constantly just trying to find a way to kill you, put you in prison, tax you to death. And now our currency is being devaluated so fast, go down and try to buy a can of soda and see how many dollars that costs you. There's no more room for passivity and quiet, submissive whining. This is a time for men and women of courage and conviction and character to stand up and fight. And it requires you to put your phone down, take those apps off your phone. Take them off. Your phone should be a way for you to call somebody or for somebody to call you. You shouldn't have Silicon Valley tech cartels following you around everywhere you go and listening and watching every single thing you do. You should not permit that. There's other things you should not permit. You should get out of your Federal Reserve notes. Get out of it. When you get paid in Federal Reserve notes, transform that money into silver and gold or diamonds or Picasso, something of value. Something that has value, because the greenbacks, the paper money, the Federal Reserve notes, they don't have any value anymore. And it's a matter of people believing it. And as soon as people start to recognize that value is gone, then the whole system itself is going to collapse. It's a fiat currency system. It's funny money. It doesn't have any value beyond the ink and paper that it's printed on. You can have a single scrap of paper that has a 1, or maybe it has a 100, or maybe it has a 50 on it. It's all just paper and ink. And whatever perceived value that it has is in your mind. It's time to get back to a gold standard, a gold and silver money. That's what the Constitution requires, that we print or we coin our money in gold and silver. Wonder why that is. So we can't end up back into massive national debt to private banking monopolies around the world, in England, in the City of London. So back to the City of London. It's not a secret. Everyone knows that the Imperial College was connected with the Wuhan lab and really used their models there in London. So now we're going to get off the banks of London and we're going to go over to the academia, the Academy of London, and the Imperial College. I mean, why does the Imperial College make models that run our lives in the United States? We should ask Donald Trump. Why did the CCP and the Imperial College get to dictate to Donald Trump what the reactions of Fauci and what the policies were going to be regarding a supposed pandemic outbreak? You see what I'm saying? This is the problem we have. We're too ignorant, we're too ill-informed, and we're too cowardly in this country to be able to maintain our own liberties and our own political freedom. This democratic republic is collapsing because the men and women who are accountable have gone into debt and have blindly gone around with their iPhones. And remember, Apple has a $250 billion secret deal with the CCP, who are a bunch of communists. So this is a massive, invisible conspiracy against American liberty and against the freemen and the political independence and the constitutional liberty established in 1776. So in order to further elucidate this whole topic, we're going to listen to another fascinating excerpt from the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, and they have to bring to us a very fascinating author and lecturer, Patrick Wood. Let's take a listen.
Where do you think we currently are in the midst of this great technocratic reset and advance of the New World Order? Because frankly, it's looking pretty bad. It is. In January 2020, when the whole COVID thing was just breaking, that's, I think it was the 29th of January, that the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. I was already watching very closely the organizations that instigated the panic around the world. Places like, some of the universities in England, for instance, the climate alarmist crowd mostly. And when I saw them jump over en masse, same MO, same people, in some cases, same computer models, when they jumped over onto the pandemic thing, let's just call it the thing, I knew that there was something big brewing, and I declared it almost immediately as technocracy's coup d'etat. I had predicted that. I think we probably talked about this before. In my first book, Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation, I predicted there would be a day when the technocrats had achieved a majority, or let's say a tipping point worth of objectives in their agenda, to where they would declare basically game over. They would go for it. They for those who ever played a game of hearts with cards, you call it shooting the moon, right? When you got that last trump card, hey, the game is over. All you got to do is play out the cards. I saw that as being fulfilled in January of 2020. And if I know somebody might be scratching their head, well, what are you, a prophet? No, not at all. But, I understand the technocrat mind. It's typically an engineering/scientific mind. People that are given over to that discipline are very disciplined about creating requirements analysis for things. That's their life, basically. Somebody says, well, hey, let's get a project going for X, whatever X is, doesn't matter. Let's get a project going. The first thing an engineer will do is pull out a quadropad. That's, for you old timers, that's the thing that has little blue lines on a piece of paper. And you'll start writing, number one, what's the first thing we need to do? Number two, what's the second thing we need to do? What do we need to acquire? What do we need to have surrounding our project to make it successful? How are we going to know when we are ready to do final testing? That's what engineers do. That's their business. And so if technocrats were behind the global takeover in the first place, you would fully expect them to have such a requirements analysis to hold up, like like literally on a piece of paper, hold it up and say, okay, check. Well, okay, this is a check, and go down and say, you know what? We've got it now. We can go for it. We can shoot the moon, as I said. I think that's exactly what they did. And every month that goes by, every week that goes by since then has confirmed my suspicion. And now I see it coming out of the mouths of the pens of all kinds of writers around the world, that there has been a global coup d'etat. Problem is, they don't understand who's behind it and who the actors are. It's like, I suppose it's like landing on the beach in Normandy, which we did once, right? You land on the beach and there are bullets flying everywhere and, bombs and airplanes, whatever. But all you conclude without knowing anything else is say, I think we're at war. Somebody's shooting at us. But if you don't know who the enemy is, how are you going to take the beach? If you can't recognize that enemy, if you don't know what their uniform looks like, for instance, or what the purpose of the war is, you're just going to sit there and scratch your head until somebody finally shoots you. You're out of the game.
Yeah, I think one of the few using that term has been Robert Kennedy Jr., who recently in his speeches I think he's used the term technocracy, and he's called it a global coup d'etat. He's pointed fingers at the CIA, who ran a number of these simulations, and along with the other usual suspects that we know of, the World Economic Forum, the CDC, the Chinese CDC, John Hopkins, so all this group of technocrats, and so. And just to look at some of the trends then that are accelerating. Your newsletter is great. I open every email. You usually have 2 to 3 pieces of news or news headlines highlighting the trends in technocracy. In fact, I think just an hour ago you had published your latest, and we're seeing the digitalization and automation of everything, especially in these last 2 years with software and robots and drones, and it's insane the pace at which it's all occurring. I'm seeing all these videos now online of restaurants with no people that where you have robots making and serving the pizza, Amazon delivery drones. You've got little sidewalk bots that are now replacing the human food delivery, such as Uber Eats. In education, they're talking about basically replacing human teachers with virtual teachers. And so, how do you feel about this trend? This is the fourth industrial revolution, right? And so this is kind of what you said, the shooting the moon. So they've now detonated 2 years ago everything, and now they're moving along with the fourth industrial revolution. So what are your thoughts on these trends in technocracy that we're seeing?
Well, the minor trends. I say minor trends because they're not causative; they're a symptom of. When we talk about robots and automation like that, physical automation, that's definitely a symptom of, and also a marker that there are technocrats at work, trying to provide solutions that nobody really asked for in the first place, especially displacing all the entry-level jobs in society. That's pretty important. But young people, they can't go in bulk now to McDonald's to get their first job. They won't when the robots get done flipping the burgers. It's going to be a lonely place for young people. But the fourth industrial revolution, if we kind of jump from there over to the Great Reset crowd, and I purposely want to do that to talk about the World Economic Forum, because they're kind of embodying this whole thing we're talking about right now. They may not all be involved directly as causative, but there are some people certainly within that crowd that are at the very, very top of this global coup d'etat. And it has a very a comparable mix to what we saw with the Trilateral Commission back in the back around 1973 when it was formed by Brzezinski and Rockefeller. They brought in legal firms, media firms, multinational corporations. They brought in some high-level politicians. There was a mix of people that they intentionally brought into the Trilateral Commission, and then they executed their plans, and basically they hid so that nobody could really, would be aware of what they're doing. Well, they were hiding back then. They're not hiding anymore. Now we see pretty much the same mix of people accumulating within the World Economic Forum. And the whole vision has been so crystallized in their mind that they now can be public. They can now write openly about what they're doing, and they are. And we don't have to guess anymore at all about what's going on. And so the World Economic Forum that is talking about the Great Reset, they're talking about building back better. There's one key thing that people are missing in this battle, and that is that until capitalism and free market economics are slaughtered on the altar, the Great Reset cannot build back better. It presupposes that our current economic system is going to be utterly crushed to death. This was kind of the scenario back in the 1930s when technocracy originally came to be, the Great Depression. And after the Great Crash of 29, by 1932, America was in the most desperate economic situation ever been in its history. It was horrible. There were soup lines, unemployment lines. People were dying of diseases and stuff. They couldn't, had no money to get medical help. And so it was a horrible, depressing time in our history. And this is where the technocrat model was originally created for, a resource-based economic system. And they believed, without any help by them, they believed that the economic system was dead. They thought it was just burned to the ground, and they were going to build back better back then. Well, capitalism and free market economics is like the biggest cruise ship in the world. It doesn't turn real fast, you can't sink it real fast, and so it keeps surviving over the decades. We pulled out World War II. We had the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There was ups and downs, and some pretty severe recessions, but it keeps on plugging along. And I am positive that these technocrats have been thinking for a long time, we're getting sick and tired of this. This monster to them, this monster of capitalism and free market economics has got to go once and for all. Crush it, get rid of it, so we can implement our resource-based economic system. Some call it the green economy. Some call it sustainable development. I call it technocracy. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. It doesn't matter really what the name is. The end result is get rid of the old and bring in the new.
So there we have Patrick Wood talking as a guest on Geopolitics and Empire podcast. And the conversation is extraordinary. I would hope you would have time to go and listen to the entire episode. And we can see that in as many different ways as possible, the different intellectuals and academics, the scholars and PhDs around the world are beginning to describe for us the predicament that we're in. And as far as his description of the technocracy that began in the 1930s with the Great Depression, you have to be able to be informed and read between the lines and understand the details of that, and to get into the nuts and bolts and into the minutia of those details. The technocracy, the takeover, the engineered coup d'etat, as it were, in the 1930s is rather simple because 1929 represented a stock market collapse on one hand, but that was symptomatic of the overall bankruptcy and collapse of the Federal Reserve System to begin with, which was introduced in 1913. So 1913, you have the introduction of the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Reserve System, and they started to print out Federal Reserve notes for the first time in history. And this became the national currency and also became eventually the international reserve currency, so that all international large commercial transactions would have to involve Federal Reserve notes. So instead of, having large shipments of bullion to back up trade, large oil shipments and large trade deals, that you would have the Federal Reserve banking note. So from the 1930s on, we're going to have the introduction. The American citizen is now going to become a commodity and a subsidiary, a subservient employee of the federal government. In as much as that now the federal government is going to have the license of you, the individual, and your biological property. So when you're born, as we said before, now after the 1930s, after that collapse, after the banks would come in, the international City of London and the international banking apparatus would come into play and say, yeah, we'll bail you out and we'll lend you the banking value, the banking credit that you need in order to pump out currency. The trade-off was the technocracy. And so this is the technocratic elite coming in and saying, okay, well, now that you have foreclosed on your country, and now that you're in hock to us, we're going to take stock of all of our assets here and all of the human resources and all the physical properties that they now possess, and they were in possession of as a result of coming in and lending the bankrupt American national enterprise more banking credit. And of course, this wasn't going to be for charity. This was going to be at interest. So compounding interest, fractional reserve banking. These are the different instruments of warfare that you can see that we were now indebted, and we were now debtors of England and their private banking cartels. And as a result, we would have to register and license with the state and certify all human births. So if you were now after this period in the 1930s, you would introduce birth certificates, and when these human assets and resources and commodities would die, we didn't need to know, because we're a technocracy, we're technocrats. We need to know how many individuals are running around and if they're paying taxes and if they're productive and what resources they produce, how much taxes they pay, so on and so forth. And so it becomes the management and the administrative state coming in to secure the social element within the nation. So social security is now going to be introduced after the 30s, because now we're moving towards socialism. We're moving towards communism, where the government just gives you a subsistence allowance, and you use that subsistence, a food allowance or a food card or whatever, to purchase your food, and you just go and live in the hovel that the government provides for you. And this is ultimately the Sovietization of America through this technocratic model that we saw introduced in the 30s in America. And so you would have the introduction of the Internal Revenue Service and taxes, where you weren't really paying taxes, because at the end of the year you would have a tax return and the government would pay your money back, and then you have a tax return, and all these different, and then of course the taxes that you would pay would be Federal Reserve notes. So as we're moving forward, we're able to articulate and describe for you the particular model of technocratic slavery that you've been introduced into and induced to, and your children had, because you were the one giving your children the social security numbers. You go in the hospital because you're not wealthy, right? You're just a regular guy. When your wife has a pregnancy and she goes into the hospital, doctors fill out the paperwork, and they give you a birth certificate, and they sign off, and they assign to you a social security number. And so you did this to your kids. You actually introduced them into commerce as tradable commodities with these documents. Just like our old money, like our old money were silver certificates. Just like JFK, he tried to, right before they killed him, like we said, we're always repeating ourselves. The facts, we're resuscitating the facts again and again, that he tried to introduce silver certificates back into the money supply and phase out Federal Reserve notes. Of course, he would be killed, and that whole plan would come to naught. But the point is that silver certificates are documents that represent silver. So if you have a certificate of silver, it certifies that document represents a certain amount of silver. And it's the same thing with your birth certificate. It's a certificate that represents the commodity, the individual that was born, and that certificate is registered with the state because you are property registered now with the state. Now, before the 1930s, birth certificates and social security numbers and IRSs and all these kind of technocratic banking machinations, they didn't exist. Neither did marriage certificates. So before the 1930s, if you go back in time, people would go down to the church, the community would get together, the minister would say the thing, and they would say, I do, and she would say, I do, and they would kiss, and they would be married, and everyone would celebrate. There wasn't a court document. There wasn't a certificate of registering your marriage through the county register into the court system, into commercial obligation to the state. So that now you have to involve your credit score. And now you and your wife, when you get married, your credit scores are tied together, and your social security numbers, which were not supposed to be used as banking numbers, but obviously that's changed. So now your credit is bound up together through these documents, through the marriage certificate. When did you ever think it was a good idea to certify with commercial documentation your marriage with the state? How would that ever become a good idea? How is that a positive idea? How is it a good idea for you to have to register in order to make it solemnized and actually to consummate it, to make it real? You have to go and get a stamp from the court. How did the court and your social security numbers and your credit score all become entangled into a mess that's your marriage? How does your credit score have anything to do with your social security number, and how does any of that have to do with a marriage certificate, and why do you need it? Just ask yourself, why did my grandparents and my great-grandparents before 1929, why did they not need a marriage certificate? Or a birth certificate, or social security documentation in order to go down and get your driver license? You see what I'm saying? This is what they mean by a technocratic model. This is the technocratic model that began to enslave the American people at the point in 1929, at this point of bankruptcy, where we became personal biological property. It was collateral to the banking apparatus and to the banking state. And now that we're entering this point now where the end point of the cycle of the currency, the Federal Reserve note is going to go spiral into hyperinflation. How's that going to affect your credit score now? Your social security number, are you going to be able to collect social security payments when you're 60 or older? Who's going to pay back those Federal Reserve notes that you're borrowing from the international banking system? Your kids, because they're the ones who are getting the social security numbers when they were born. You're getting old and you're becoming a social security recipient with your social security number, and the new kids who are being born, they're the ones who are going to pay it. They're being enslaved by these trillions of dollars of spending. And of course, you never heard anything about this. This is all conspiracy theory. This is all crazy nonsense, so that you never have to think or use your brain. You just follow down the pathway towards your decline and your own destruction and that of your children. Look at your child. Look at your son and your daughter. Look at them and explain to me how it is you're going to give them a future that has anything but just horror and famine and starvation and poverty, penniless paupers in hock to the money powers of Europe. So if you don't get off your phone, get your face out of Facebook, and start to take back responsibility, then the consequences are something that you're going to have to just accept and ultimately live with. So at any point, if you would like to show me how wrong and misguided I am, please hit the email, straighten me out, give me some new information, show me how I'm missing it and how I'm just totally off base. I'd love for you to do that any chance you get. And if you can't do that, you don't have any information to refute what I'm saying, then you should go ahead and take a look at the documents that I offer and the show notes and the different information that I tie in with the show and my explanation for these particular phenomenon. And you just go ahead and take some time out of your day and do a little research and go into this subject matter and find out where I'm wrong. And if I'm not wrong, then you have an issue on your hands. You're being informed now by someone who cares about this country and this nation, who has a major problem with the government, which is changeable, which can be fixed, which can, and the same thing with the Federal Reserve note, and the supposed money that we owe back to the international banking apparatus, the World Bank and the Bank of International Settlements and the World Economic Forum and all these globalist institutions. And we could just tell them to shove it. And we could just go ahead and print out silver certificates like the courageous and brave and highly intelligent John F. Kennedy was doing. He was somebody who was an American, a nationalist who was concerned about making sure that America got back on track on its sovereignty and wasn't interested in being beholden to the globalist elite who were beginning to break down on a technocratic level the entire system of America itself is being broken down into a corporate hierarchy, if you will. And so you could see that Kennedy paid that ultimate price, and that was the price that none of us, apparently, in the American populace are willing to stand up and pay. We're not willing to say what needs to be said or do what needs to be done or make the preparations that need to be made in order to prepare for the struggle and for the victory that is required against this assault and this tyranny that's bringing our country down. So right now, if you look in Washington, D.C., you can see that we have political prisoners that are being held without trial, without a release date. That these are individuals who are on a pre-trial basis who haven't even really been to court or haven't been given an opportunity to get bail, and most of them are all on misdemeanor charges. And they've been held for over a year. And what are you doing? Just sitting in your house eating a sandwich? What happens when it comes to you? What is your wife going to do? What's your kid going to do when you're hauled off and taken away because you're a military-age man and you might have a problem with what they're going to do next? Here, let's go ahead and listen to an individual who actually has a set of gonads, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has some courage and who's a real American. And let's listen to her take on what happened when she went to visit the January 6th prisoners.
And then you've been one of the few people that have actually tried to find out what's happened to some of these people, right?
Yeah.
So walk us through that. Who's in this DC jail? What are the conditions? What are they charged with? Just walk us through that in great detail, because it's a real it's not a covered story, not anywhere close to what it should be.
No, not anywhere, and it deserves so much. So they committed crimes. They've some of them just have misdemeanors from just walking around on Capitol grounds.
Okay, so some are as low as misdemeanors.
Yes.
So explain to me, though, why some people are being released on bond and these aren't. I mean, is it... I don't understand, because some...
Right. So, Charlie, you're asking the common sense questions and the questions we should be able to ask in America, but we have to talk about this, understanding that we've been too nice calling Democrats socialist. We've been too nice calling them authoritarians. This is communism, real communism. These are people that are in control and they're abusing their power, and it's not just the ones in Congress and in the White House, it's also in the FBI, the Department of Justice, and it's all across. They are persecuting their political enemies. And it is purposeful to tell the rest of the American people, this is what's going to happen to you.
So talk about what's actually happening in the jail. So they committed crimes.
They did. They're charged. Well, the FBI, we saw them raid their homes. They went and found people, arrested them.
They bring them back to D.C.?
Yes. There's approximately 40 to 50 in the D.C. jail right now.
So these people didn't get to serve. They didn't hear out their cases.
They haven't been to court. They're pre-trial January 6th defendants. Not only are they in D.C., they're also across the country in other jails. Yesterday, I had to call in. There's a man in a jail there in Georgia that was having medical issues, and they were refusing to give him medical treatment. And so his fiance was desperately trying to get someone to check on him and get help because no one's allowed to go visit him. He's pre-trial. But in the D.C. jail, here was the issue. While everything was ramping up and everyone's being framed as insurrectionists, and then Nancy Pelosi is building her case for the January 6th committee, as the months went by, January, February, March, and April, we were hearing things about these people that have been arrested. We were hearing that they've been beaten, and we were hearing they're being held in solitary confinement. And I was like, is this really true? How do we find out if this is true? So along with a couple of my colleagues, and I only say a couple because most of my conference, my Republican conference, refuses to have anything to do with this. But it was me, Paul Gosar, Louis Gohmert, and Matt Gaetz. We went to the D.C. jail, and as members of Congress, we tour facilities all the time. ICE detention centers, jails and other places, all kinds of federally funded buildings and programs. We tour them. That's what we do because we fund them. And the District of Columbia, people need to remember, Congress has oversight over the District of Columbia because it's not a state. They want to be a state, but they're not a state at this time. And hopefully they never will be. But so we go to the jail and we're like, hi, we're members of Congress. Here's our ID. We would like a tour of the jail. We were met instantly with a woman named Deputy Warden Kathleen Landerkin. She's the person in charge at the jail. And she told us that we were trespassing. Trespassers. You're not allowed to. We said, no, you don't understand. We're members of Congress. We're here for oversight and to tour the jail. We want to see the whole facility. Denied us entrance. Kept going back. Denied us entrance. Every time, so we couldn't go in. So finally, we've written letters. We had been calling attention to it, doing everything we could. Finally, I got a phone call, and it's just been barely a month now. And they said, it was like 6:15. I was on the house floor. You can come and tour the jail at 6:30. 15 minutes notice. And they were just so happened to let the city council in Washington, D.C. was getting a tour. And so they probably figured, hey, we'll throw her in and get this done. So we rushed down there as fast as we could. Louis Gohmert from Texas went with me. So it was he and I and a couple members from our staff. We go in and tour the jail, and we saw the entire prison, saw everywhere, all the different programs. We saw education programs, continuing education, job training. We saw moot court where they were practicing their trials with a third-year law student from Georgetown. We saw all, places where they get their haircut, chapel, Islam temple in there. It was really interesting. Most of the signs up on the wall was telling felons they could vote. Now you can vote in the District of Columbia. Felons can vote. Those signs were everywhere. Saw some reading material, but the most common reading material in the jail was the Nation of Islam newspaper. That was the most common. It was everywhere. The books that they had were very CRT focused about race and especially about the prison system.
Incarceration.
Yes, they're all there because they're black, all of that stuff. So that was a lot of the type of information. And then our tour was coming to a close. And we said, no, we're here to see where the January 6th defendants are too. Thank you for showing us the whole jail. We'd like to see there. And they, no, ma'am, that's not part of your tour. And so will save you a lot of time, but we had quite a heated conversation because I wasn't leaving. And I told them very point blank, I said, listen to me right now. If you do not take us in there and show us where these January 6th defendants are, I'm going to go on every single news station I can find. I said, I'll go on CNN. I don't care. I'll go on every single one. I will be in front of the press every single day. And I'll tell them everything I saw here and that you are hiding something with these people. So that was the chief of staff of the mayor's office that I told that to. And I told Deputy Warden Kathleen Landerkin that. And so they made a phone call. He stepped out of the way. Well, let me tell you what happened. He steps back and he's like, I'll make a phone call. And he walks through this doorway. And as he goes through the doorway, somebody presses a button and a prison door with actual bars rolls shut. And he's over there making the phone call and we're all standing on this side. And we go, we're all looking at each other, we're like, that wasn't accidental. And we said it out loud, like, oh, you didn't do that on purpose. No, I'm sure, like, what, of course, what's over there? Is that where they are? So we're really angry. And he comes back in view on the other side of the door, and he said the director gave him permission. Then magically, the prison door rolls back open. And then guess where we go to see the January 6th defendants? We go that way, where they were locking us out. You couldn't even make this up. We had no idea that's where those people were being held. They were so worried about what's back there that they literally shut a prison door to keep us from going back there, and we didn't know where they were back there.
What did you see?
Well, they took us back, and when we went inside, we went in through these double doors and walked into sort of a big center room that was like a common area with some picnic tables. And there was nothing on the walls. It was different than other areas we'd seen. There were no televisions, no signs telling them that felons could vote. But they're pre-trial anyways. They haven't even been to court. These people...
This is a detention center.
They're being detained pre-trial. So we go in there, and I'll never forget it in my entire life, Charlie. These men just came. Some of them were there, and they came out from like where their cells were and stuff. And they just started clapping and cheering and were overwhelmed with so much emotion, and they were crying, and just even their body language was like just bent over, and they were overwhelmed at the sight of us. And they instantly knew who I was. They knew who Louis Gohmert was. And they were thanking us, hugging our staff, thanking us, shaking our hands, because no one's come for them. No one's come to see them. And in their eyes, you could see that they felt forgotten and that they really are being treated like political prisoners of war.
And there's like 40 or 50 of them.
Yes, and they look horrible. They've been held in there. Some of them since January. They haven't been outside, so they just don't look healthy. The food there is horrible. They're not allowed to shave or get haircuts, so their beards are long and scraggly. Their hair looks terrible. They just are not kept. They're not healthy because they're being detained in a place where they're not being.
And they're not even allowed to post bail. Some of these people.
No, they're not allowed to post bail, and this is what's really interesting. So, definitely, some of them they've done that. Yes, I'm not. It's not about their cases.
So as we go forward, I'm just going to put in a pause there. You can listen to the interview yourself. But the point is that she's right, that they're being held on emergency war powers. So they're never going to see a courtroom. They're held in pre-trial to where they don't have a right to a speedy trial. All their constitutional rights are being completely abridged and withheld from them. And as we're going forward, we can see that this entire situation with January 6th was an FBI setup so that they could have these victims in this new Bastille dungeon where they're wasting away. Can you imagine being held for over a year without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom at pre-trial status? This is, and you know who's not looking into this? You are. You are not concerned about this. You're not doing anything about this. Did you do anything to talk to your senator or your representatives or write a letter to Joe Biden or to do anything at all to get some kind of redress in this issue of this tyrannical, totalitarian persecution of these political prisoners that's taking place in Washington, D.C.? I mean, this neo-Stasi police force there in Washington, D.C. who has the power to reach out over all the different states and counties of the U.S. and just find people that they want to arrest. And these people are presumed innocent. These 40 or 50 people, don't tell me what they did on January 6th. They've never been to trial. Nobody knows where they were at on January 6th because they haven't been able to have a lawyer to present evidence or just depositions or to show evidence that they were even involved. So these people are presumed innocent until they're proven guilty with a speedy trial. It's 180 days max. So don't tell me that they shouldn't win in the Capitol. We don't know what they did. They're innocent. As far as we know, they just pulled somebody off a train in Wisconsin and just arrested them and carted them away and stuck them in this dungeon. And you don't have any documentation to show me otherwise that these people were somehow malefactors on January 6th and they acted out? Show me the proof. I want to see a trial. I want to see evidence and lawyers. I want to see a judge. Nope. So since you're sitting at home in the quiet and solitude of your house with your beloved family around, these people are not. And there's other people that are being held around the United States. And these are rendition protocols that we use against enemies or foreign combatants in Guantanamo Bay. So we have a new Guantanamo Bay in Washington, D.C. Just a political dungeon so that anyone who gets set up by the new Stasi, the FBI, and the polarized political weaponry of the Washington, D.C. apparatus can just be used against the public at large. So you're supposed to be scared. You're supposed to be sitting at home, quaking in your boots because they might just snatch you up. I mean, did you look at any of the pictures or the photographs or the videos of what happened on January 6th? Well, you're tied in. You're just one jump away because their espionage and their cyber NSA apparatus can spy on you, watch what you do, get an idea of what you think, and how even if you're being quiet and you're being a good citizen, you're going to work every day, minding your business, they want to know what you think. They want to know that maybe you're going to be a future problem and you're going to be a future insurrectionist. That's what this is all about. This is all about getting the people to fall into internecine civil conflagration so that you're looking around at each other as racists or as people who are disease vectors who aren't wearing a mask, or you're atomized into individual, weakened sycophants and subjects of the federal apparatus. Because all they want to know is show me your ID and registration. Show me that you are submitted and that we've taken a picture of you and we documented. Show me your documents and your papers. That's all they want to see. This is a technocracy. It's no different than the same exact regime that was happening in Stalin's Russia and the Soviet Union, or with Hitler when you couldn't even go outside and walk to the store unless some guys with soldiers wanted to see your papers. And there's no redress. And if your daughters get raped, there's no one to go to. And if your sons and your family members get thrown into a dungeon, there's no court. You never see them again. I mean, these guys aren't even allowed to shave. This is pitiful. This is pathetic. You should be outraged. Unless you're an agent of the federal government and it's your job to go ahead and just oversee the American people picking each other apart. It's your job to inform on your neighbors. Is that what you do? Is that your job? If you're like a cop caller, every little incident, you punch a 911 and letting the state know everything that's going on? Because you're a do-gooder, right? You're there to run other people's lives and tell them, how it's going to work, how things are going to go. Fauci got on TV and said it. Everyone better obey the directives, right? The directives that are coming down the pike from the globalist elite. There's no law on this. There's not even a statutory law. No one in Congress voted to say that you have to wear mask. This is all corporatism. This is all just fascism from the corporate elite. They're telling you that you can't go in and buy food unless you do what they say, boy. That's what you better do what they say. That's what this is all about. It's not about vaccines or insurrections or elections or voting machines. This is about you better do what they tell you. And while we're sitting here being taken apart by all the infiltration and the leftist ideology that's being introduced through these communists. I mean, this is the Obama crowd, the Clinton crowd, all the people that went to Howard University and went to Georgetown and were educated by the Jesuit priests there, and they were told how everything is systemically racist and how to tear the system apart and how to defund the police and how to bring down the system, and all this. So we have this fifth column of traitors and backstabbers and cutthroats, these neo-Jacobins, the new neo-Bolsheviks, right, that are being raised up through our college classrooms to come and burn down the gates within our country. We have the enemy that's being built up outside of our country. And this, of course, ties back to the British Empire once again, because you know that Beijing and Hong Kong were ultimately controlled by the British for many, many centuries. I don't know, centuries, decades, how long? We'll have to go back and check the history. But China wasn't sovereign and didn't get control of its own government until the British left. And when the British left and gave the Chinese government over to Mao Zedong, the communist, in 1949, then we have the introduction of the CCP, this monstrous dictatorship, this authoritarian communist regime that's responsible for killing millions and millions of Chinese people, just like Stalin. It's just Stalinism in China. That's what the British left the Chinese people to. They didn't leave them with a democracy. They didn't leave them with a republic or some kind of like capitalist system. They just left them in the hands of these violent communist murderers. And that's where the Chinese people have been subject to ever since. So this weapon, this CCP, this Chinese military criminal cartel, international criminal syndicate that has nuclear weapons, has been built up to become the invading force at our borders. And this is something that no one wants to do and address. No one wants to discuss it. No one wants to take a look at the fact that as we're beating each other to death over politics inside the United States, that a very massive military being built up to destroy us from the outside. And this is not just a random coincidence. This is all coordination and decades and centuries long planning. And like we said before, it goes back to the Congress of Vienna, the Holy Alliance. It goes back to, in 1822, it goes back to the secret Treaty of Verona and Shuri. So this is, from 1822 to 2022, this plan for the destruction of the West, of democratic, republican ideals and institutions has been in the works for quite a long time. So the appearance of this violent, psychopath regime, communist regime in China isn't just an accident. It's being developed. It's coming to fruition. It's being prepared for the destruction of the West, which is you and me. And this is the same exact regime that Biden is sold out to, that this crackhead, this pedophile pervert Hunter Biden has been receiving millions and billions of dollars from. And they're also involved over in Ukraine. The Bidens are up to their necks and messing around with this situation in Ukraine, which has everything to do with pushing Putin into war. Putin is just some guy who runs the Russian state. He doesn't need war with the West. But idiots and elite puppets like the Bidens, like those crackheads, have been up to their necks, like I just said, in manipulating the situation at Burisma, which is in Ukraine. And now we have all these war drums beating in Ukraine. So it's time for you as the American citizen to wake up and stop being a thumb-sucking baby and to do what you need to do and man up. And even if you have to lay down your life, at least you lay down your life in the place of honor and duty. And you don't get to go to bed in the slave chamber and die like an old man with no haircut, no shave, with no core. And these people have lost all their rights. That's you. They're your neighbors. They're American citizens. We should go up there to that jail in Washington, D.C. We should free them. There you go. You want to get it? You want to talk about something that needs to be talked about? We should go and free those people out of that jail. We represent 370 million Americans. You don't think we can go up to that jail in Washington, D.C. and get them out of there in about 5 hours? We could do it. Right now we're going to stay home and suck our thumbs. We're too busy being alcoholics and sitting here and, changing diapers. We're just babies. Just big, sad babies who can't take responsibility for our government. And as they put us into debt, they put us into hock, as they put us our marriages into commercial transaction. What does your credit score have to do with your wedding certificate, have to do with your marriage? And then you wonder why people can't maintain their marriage and end up with all these divorces. It's not a surprise. It's time for you to wake up. It's time for you to do what you need to do and to be a big boy and to be a grown-up woman and to take responsibility for your country. So to that end, to the end of taking responsibility and learning and becoming citizens who are aware, let's take a listen to this discussion on War Room and be edified by that.
We're having a major throwdown on the genocide games to make sure that we don't have another debacle like the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, where, the Western media, for all the talk they did about the Jesse Owens Olympics and all that, really played into Hitler's hands in 1936. And this is what the mainstream media and the NBC, you see MSNBC, you see Joy-Ann Reid, you see Ari Melber, you see Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes and all those guys, the big crocodile tears and injustice throughout the world. It's all crap, okay? Because they are taking a paycheck for the people that gave the Chinese Communist Party billions to basically provide a global platform for their propaganda against principally the Chinese people. The Chinese people, Lao Beijing. But Frank, I want to walk through other aspects of people closer to home that people may not be thinking about. One I know you've been focused on is South America, Central America, the Monroe Initiative. Walk us through, we just had an election a week or so ago where the right-wing candidate kind of a little bit got smoked. Walk us through your fear of what's happening in Latin America, South America today, how it's going to impact people, and the dark hand of the Chinese Communist Party behind it.
So first, thanks for taking this kind of time to focus on the big picture, because if we don't, we are going to miss critical parts of what I'm fearful is teeing up to become the next world war. You mentioned the 1936 Olympics, of course. That was the precursor to Adolf Hitler's, pursuit of domination first of Europe, but he envisioned global domination ultimately. And I'm quite certain that the Chinese Communist Party has the same idea in mind. If, as Hitler was, they are legitimated, honored, lifted up by the international community, further reinforcing their confidence that they can act with impunity. But turning to Latin America, Steve, this is one of the places in which I was frankly stunned to learn when we did a study in the Committee on the Present Danger of China, called me the inspiration for it. You were actually the inspiration for it, and we salute, what you did to get it started and all the help you've given to us in amplifying its messaging. But the thing that I think I was most surprised about when we did a study of the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative was the extent to which it has in fact already sunk its hooks into 145 nations, I think, as of last summer, out of about 190 total. And by that I mean that they have now got either active agreements in place that they are using to facilitate the build-out, not just of the obvious commercial, global, colonial empire, with domination of markets and the exploitation of resources and the construction of immense amounts of infrastructure, often using money that they've gotten from us. through our capital markets and the various investments that are made by Wall Street and the like. But what we're, I think, now increasingly confronting, Steve, is that virtually all of that infrastructure is inherently dual use and can be adapted or is designed to be exploited by the Chinese for power projection. So in Latin America, what they are doing is becoming essentially the dominant force in something called the Forum of Sao Paulo, which is kind of the Chinese Communist Party's version of the Communist Internationale, with the indigenous nations that have already succumbed to China are run now by communists, including Peru most recently, and now Chile is in the process of succumbing to it. But they intend to build out from there, notably next year, by taking out the two remaining pro-Western democracies, large and important countries in South America, Colombia and Brazil. And they're going to be using these facilities, these assets, these networks, road, rail, digital, as well as the various mineral resources that they now control and their exploitation to essentially lock up our hemisphere and, again, project power from it. For example, in Peru, just a quick thought on this, Steve, because you'll particularly appreciate this as a naval officer. Peru has not one but two, one that is a building, the other that is in the works, mega ports on the west coast of South America, which will not only be able to house large container vessels that the Chinese, of course, have thousands and thousands of, but also carrier battle groups. It will make for, I believe, the Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids, starting
big time
in the very near future.
I want to pull the camera back just for 1 second on Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. And we've had the Monroe Doctrine for a reason, right? For a reason. That's why you have the Monroe Initiative. But I want to pull the camera back. The Chinese Communist Party has so polluted the arable land of China, their food production is a disaster. They've so polluted the air with the coal-burning plants that don't have clean coal. Disaster. Their rivers, all polluted. Disaster. You know, Miles Gore tells us all the time, they have turned China into a dumping ground environmentally. They look at Latin America as Lebensraum. They look at it as living space. They look at this with the great resources of South America. They look at this as their growth opportunity. Australia and South America. And let's pull the camera back. It's not just South America. It's Central America with the Suez Canal, of which they control, and they're building another one for deeper port vessels and carrier battle groups. Also, the Caribbean. Look at the Bahamas. They have the largest, I think they have the largest embassy, quote unquote, looks like a massive bunker to monitor, to make sure that they can monitor all submarine traffic and all traffic in and out of the Caribbean. And they're building a port. They're aligning themselves to build a port in, East Africa? And people know from the geography, we don't have the map up. But to organic, you can see how remember, Brazil's a time zone. People don't realize Brazil's a time zone ahead of us on the East Coast. South America pushes out when you really look at the map. Close to Africa, that's a choke point. Brazil's a time zone. People don't realize Brazil's a time zone ahead of us on the East Coast. South America pushes out when you really look at the map. Close to Africa, that's a choke point. Strategically, they see Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and particularly the west coast of South America for their ports. They have the the Panama Canal with a new canal that can take deeper vessels, not just transport vessels, but carrier battle groups, and the Caribbean, and also now in East Africa. This is a highly sophisticated. I want to talk about One Belt, One Road. When Biden just passed the infrastructure bill, One Belt, One Road is essentially an infrastructure bill using kind of the British East India Company's model, predatory capitalism. They buy off the elites in these countries, particularly the left-wing elites. The most corrupt of all of them is Lula, That criminal, who was paid for by the Chinese Communist Party for the commodities back in the early parts of this century, the 21st century, is one of the reasons he's in prison with all his corruption. He's criminal number one. He's running against Bolsonaro in Brazil. Mm-hmm. This is what Gaffney and the Committee on the Present Danger are warning you. This is just not individual dictators, tin pot dictators down in Central and Latin America. No, these are backed by the resources, the influence, and the power, because it's power projection of the greatest existential threat this country has ever had. Frank Gaffney, your analysis of that.
Well, let me just back the lens a little bit further up, because, Steve, it's not just the east coast of Africa or the west coast of Africa, it's the entire continent of Africa
West Coast,
that have been similarly put in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. It's South Asia. It's Central Asia. It's East Asia. It's the United States of America. It's Canada. You are talking about an enterprise that has been beavering away at this for decades. As you say, it's the East India Company model combined with payday loans, whereby the Chinese use our money, I think significantly, to lend to these various countries, or really pay for the infrastructure that Chinese nationals build in those countries. And then, inevitably, when the payments can't be made by these mostly poor countries, the Chinese foreclose on these assets. And that's when they become even more dedicated as power projection instruments with bases and, their military using their airports and their road networks, rail networks, and the like. And it's meant to connect to other nations which may not have completely succumbed to the Chinese domination and exercise control over them inevitably over time. So, Steve, when I say that I fear we're at the cusp of a global war, my concern is partly this infrastructure is all waiting to begin being used to supplement and enforce those kinds of operations.
You've been working this beat for 50 years now? Started out with President Reagan in the 80s. You said, I'm afraid we're either starting, or close to a next world war. Frank Gaffney, founder of the Committee on Present Danger, China. What do you mean by that?
Steve, look, I hope I'm wrong about this, needless to say, but what I mean by this is the
founder of the Committee on Present Danger, China. What do you mean by that?
Steve, look, I hope I'm wrong about this, needless to say, but what I mean by this is that, as we were talking about with respect to China, and specifically the degree to which China has become a global colonial enterprise, but also with respect to something that you were just touching on, the distinct possibility that Iran has reached a point where it is going to be either precipitating conflict with Israel or at the receiving end of what Israel feels compelled to precipitate on its part. And then you've got, of course, the Russians, and what the Russians are up to with respect to Ukraine, most obviously, but quite possibly the Baltics or the nations of Eastern Europe, or even beyond, as a matter of fact, are all places in which there is now a very perilous situation, and if any of those actually goes supernova, what I'm anticipating is, whether by prearrangement, as a function of the working partnerships, if not formal alliances, that China has established with Iran on the one hand and Russia on the other, to say nothing of North Korea, which may not have gone to war initially, or may not have begun the kinetic phase of the war, jumping into it for the purpose of exploiting our distractedness and capitalizing on the opportunity to fulfill their ambitions, their territorial ambitions, their geopolitical ambitions, at our expense. So I think the fact of it is there's now the combustible material, Steve, for a global conflagration.
You speak Mandarin, you're a naval intelligence officer. You know the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing better, I think, than anybody in Washington, D.C. You see the Huawei situation. Is Ben Harnwell right? Do we need to actually get the type of how McCarthy went after, and for all McCarthy's faults, and he had a lot of grievous faults, he exposed from the FDR's administration what had happened, and Harry Truman went on top of things. The corruption and the rot, the Soviet Union, the KGB, the spies they had in there, right? And guys like I.F. Stone, right, eventually became exposed as KGB, at least assets or close to being assets. The CCP, those guys are pikers, right? The ability of those guys to steal the hydrogen, the atomic bomb first, where Stalin made a priority of, then the hydrogen bomb later. They were pikers compared to what the CCP's done at every level. The reason is it's a country that's 100 times wealthier, right? Jack Posobiec, your thoughts? You see this Huawei situation in Cambridge, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere. And the Biden administration is totally compromised. Jack Posobiec.
To put this in terms that might be, perhaps a little more accessible for people, this would be like if during the Cold War that the KGB came around and said, hey, we're going to line up and lay all the phone lines for all of your top universities, all of your top think tanks, everything that's connected to your defense and national security systems, everything that's connected to the Pentagon. We're going to lay that down for you. And don't worry, because our systems are better than anything that you guys have locally or anything that you guys have in NATO or your Western alliances. And we promise, by the way, that everything will be done above board. It's a complete joke, but I think that Americans and Westerners writ large, and what Ben Harnwell is hitting on, is the fact that people don't realize the level of penetration of our national security agencies, of our think tanks, right, and of our universities. Because, you had a great interview last night, and it was Amanda Milius on Tim Pool. Fantastic, right? And Amanda is the classic non-linear thinker. So, Tim's trying to pin her down. He can never get there. But she had a great line, right? It's hilarious. You got to watch it. She had a great line. She said, so you have a situation where the West has always been run on ideas. But what happens when the centers, the locus of our idea centers are penetrated and controlled by one of our foreign adversaries? That has always been that nexus. You see this with the administrative state. What was the biggest outcome of the creation of the administrative state under Woodrow Wilson? This was the leakage of American sovereignty from government, where the founders wanted it to be. It is now leaked out into the administrative state, and it is leaked out into the academy. So if you want to control the American government, you don't need to go straight to Congress anymore. You can just go into the academy. You can go into these think tanks, these areas where the sovereignty has spilled over because of the creation of the administrative state. Understand this. The CCP understands our system better than we do. And you've heard it again and again and again. They know the two fulcrums of power in the United States, two of the largest fulcrums when it comes to the U.S. government, are Wall Street and the academy. So where do they target specifically for these infiltration operations, and where do they target specifically to fund these junkets, as Natalie Winters, of course, has documented tirelessly again and again. They know. It's funny to me, actually, that you look at these Harvard professors going to jail, and our leaders have sold out their country and have sold out their countrymen for pittance.
So I'm going to come back in a second. Your theory of the case is actually that it's not Thucydides' trap. It's not even tributary state anymore. And it's not elite capture. Those are old concepts. The new concept is really Jack Posobiec came up with. It's elite merger. But I want to get, by the way, the Natalie Winters, let's get from last night. Natalie Winters' great piece on Pfizer. I'm going to pick a random name out. Pfizer.
Yeah.
Pfizer. In business with a tracking system to help the Chinese Communist Party.
By the way, Steve, I didn't...
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm listening to Natalie Winters last night on War Room, kind of, have it in one ear while I'm running around with the family. And I go and I look up and I say, I pull up 2009, Pfizer announces that they're going to be opening up a facility where? In Wuhan, China. But then, of course, the great Wuhan clan, if you're not following him on Twitter, you've got to, he goes and pulls up and says, hey, there's an article from early 2020 about it. You go click, 404, press release not found. It's covered up. They're deleting the press releases from Pfizer about their collaboration in Wuhan.
We're going to get to the bottom of it, but I want to, and this is.
And by the way, Steve, I saw this when I was there in Shanghai at the American Chamber of Commerce. We know that all the American pharmaceuticals and Western pharmaceuticals are doing their precursor sourcing from China. This isn't, something. By the way, GlaxoSmithKline got in huge trouble over there because of they had a little, the red bags and the red envelopes that they were giving out, because that's part of the system in China. Is you have to bribe people, you got to grease the wheels. Well, in the Western system, that's no go.
But this is also allowed by Beijing. They don't care about. You think the CCP? You think Pfizer, with no controls over them, care what happens to humans?
No, I'm talking about the elites. I'm talking about the elites. The Lao Beijing. That's victim number one. The Lao Beijing, by the way, were paraded through the streets of Jiangxi. Right? They're putting. If you've been declared a criminal, they're going back to the struggle sessions. You had the struggle sessions during the Cultural Revolution. Now we've got the COVID struggle sessions. And they're going to declare these guys to be lockdown rule breakers. And they're saying, they're traffickers and they're cross-border this. And they're parading them through the streets in full hazmat gear with the Gestapo police marching behind them, arms, twisted behind their back.
Hang on.
So there are major issues there. In the Xi'an district, the massive city, it's 17 million people. Or maybe that's inaccurate, 13 million. It's a massive city. It's larger than New York City. And they've shut it down, and they're doing a lot of horrifying things in Xi'an. It looks like we said before, that there's going to be some starvation events. People can barely leave their homes to go get food, but a couple of times a week. And if they try to, and they get caught in the streets by the Gestapo there, running around in hazmat suits, then they'll be rounded up and marched around in the streets like criminals to be perp walked in front of everybody and humiliated and put down and ultimately just castigated for their crime of trying to leave their home to get food, because of course that's endangering everyone else, because they might pass around the disease. So it's this totalitarian fascistic regime in the CCP there that has just taken captive the entire city there in Xi'an, and just totally lock them down. You can see that whatever's going to come out of it next is going to be horrifying, and it's going to be terrifying. And of course, we're going into the Olympics, so we're going to have the Genocide Olympics there in China, and everyone's going to go and participate with the CCP as they continue to systematically slaughter and put into slave camps the Uyghur people, and then utterly enslave them and kill them for their body parts. And everyone knows that the Falun Gong practitioners who were outlawed by the CCP, and the various Wuhan, various Uyghur peoples, or anyone who's a dissident and gets disappeared by the CCP, could have their organs harvested and sold in the black market. So that's what we're dealing with. So let's go to the Olympics and support China, because we're not racist, right? That's the whole idea there. And of course, the news media is going to do puff pieces and make this whole situation, this horrible butchery that is being committed in a massive industrial scale, larger in scale really than what happened in the Holocaust. They haven't got around to actually gassing millions of Chinese people in gas chambers yet, but just the wholesale enslavement, murder, and incarceration, and using as slave labor the Uyghur people, and the enslavement, murder, the Falun Gong, all those inhuman crimes against humanity that are being committed by the CCP are just going to be whitewashed away by the corporate news media in this country. And of course, they're all assets bought and sold by the CCP, just like LeBron James. What a pig LeBron James is. He has his shoes being made by Chinese slave labor, so that he can be a billionaire and be a kingpin here in America, and he can have his shoes made for pennies while he comes over here and sells them for hundreds and hundreds of dollars, so he can be a rich man at the cost of slave labor. And then he likes to turn around and talk about critical race issues and how in the past his ancestors were just greatly wronged by slavery in America, and how horrible it is, and he's such a victim of racism. But then he has no problem turning around and having his overly priced, crappy shoes made by poor Chinese slave labor. So that's the kind of hypocritical and mind-numbing atrocities that we're going to have to be coping with here in the 21st century. So we're going to have to discuss in future episodes more about the Durham report that's coming up, where we had the individual Sussman who works with Perkins Coie. It looks like he's going to go up the road and go to jail for lying to the FBI on behalf of Hillary Clinton in order to frame Donald Trump for Russian ties. And then Danchenko also is getting, so it looks like he got arrested, and looks like they're going to go up the chain of the individuals there and move on up to the higher ones and to who actually made the decision to basically violate and corrupt the FISA courts. And there with James Comey, I think all of them should be brought up and should be investigated and be, indicted if it's necessary in order for justice, and in order to really take a closer look at that whole issue there that's happening in Washington D.C. with the politicization of the bureaucracy and the federal intelligence agencies is a major problem. And in order to discuss that further, we have this particular interview here with Darren Beatty from Revolver, and he has this explosive article regarding the January 6th so-called insurrection. It looks like it was a huge setup by the FBI, and we talked about this in other podcast episodes, and we're going to discuss it again in further depth now. So let's listen to Darren Beatty from Revolver News.
Yes. Part 1 and 2 of the investigative series here. It's Meet Ray Epps. Part 1 and Part 2. And so just to sum up very briefly, you demonstrate in pretty certain terms that a group of 4 or 5 or 6 men were working closely together to engineer the entry of the public there into the Capitol building, first onto restricted grounds and then into the Capitol building. And then part 2 of this is the question of why these seem to be the least prosecuted men involved in this thing, when literally moms who were just standing around on the lawn outside are going to prison. So this is really huge. I guess take us through and start with who is Ray Epps, please.
That's a great question. To some degree, he's become something of a household name, which I'm very pleased by. But in case your listeners aren't familiar with this individual, Ray Epps, he is the person, the singular person, the sole person, who in the mountains of video and documentary evidence of January 6th and the days leading up to it, he's the only person caught on video, dead to rights, making an explicit call to go into the Capitol, stating an explicit mission to go into the Capitol. And in fact, he does this repeatedly, marshaling multiple groups with different agendas on January 5th, the day before, saying, there are a bunch of different groups, there are people clashing with Black Lives Matter, there are a lot of people in Washington that day for a lot of different reasons. And he was going to each group insisting that they focus on the agenda that matters, and that's going into the Capitol. People were shocked. In fact, in many occasions, people accused him of being a Fed just because it was such a bizarre and radical suggestion. Nonetheless, he persisted, and this wasn't simply a one-off of someone who may have been drunk and was just calling for nonsense, and then we never heard of him. On January 6th, the day after, and the fateful day, the day of the so-called insurrection, the so-called Capitol siege, this same individual, Ray Epps, is a veritable Where's Waldo figure. He's everywhere. He's everywhere directing people to, quote, go to the Capitol. That's where our problems are. Attention, folks, after Trump's speech, we're all going to the Capitol. Spread the word. Spread the word. He's everywhere spreading this word, all the way up to the point of seconds before the initial and decisive breach of Capitol grounds, that famous clip of the metal barricade being, busted down by rioters. He's right there, situated perfectly and conveniently. He whispers into Ryan Samsel's ear, and 2 seconds later, Samsel leads the charge of this initial breach. So the same individual who's marshaling everyone to this bizarre and unheard of agenda to go into the Capitol. Fast forward all the way to the next day at 12:53 p.m. Incidentally, Trump is still speaking. All the Trump supporters are listening to Trump at this point. But weirdly, Mr. Ray Epps, who is wearing a Trump hat and is such a fan of Trump, presumably, that he traveled all the way from Arizona to D.C., he just skipped the Trump speech altogether in order to follow through on his stated mission. And he's standing right there, and he whispers into an individual's ear, and 2 seconds later, the initial decisive breach of the Capitol grounds occurred. And what's amazing is, this guy is not charged with anything. He's not indicted. The vaunted January 6th Commission has interests in seemingly anyone who set foot within a mile radius of D.C. having their full communication record. They want nothing to do with him. The feds initially put him on one of the top 20 people on their most wanted list, but after he got attention, after he was actually identified, after Revolver.News ran a piece on his fellow oath keeper, Stuart Rhodes, whom we could talk about as well, the day after that, the feds very quietly scrubbed the name and the face and the public profile of Ray Epps off of their database completely, and since then they deny knowing who he even is. So that's the mystery of Ray Epps, who's just one of the suspicious scandals of many covered in this Revolver.News series.
All right, and there is so much there, but I want to focus on one point really quick, which is a side issue on this story, but it's so important, and this is also my guilty conscience talking because I haven't covered this on the show, but it is huge. Can you give us just a paragraph about the regular people who've been arrested for being either in the Capitol or on the grounds, but essentially just being mom and dad Trump supporters who followed the crowd and didn't really do anything, who are doing, being held without bail for, almost a year now straight and this kind of thing? It seems pretty egregious and fairly uncovered.
Of course. No, that's such an important question because these are two sides of the same coin. What's damningly suspicious, what is inexplicable in relation to people like Ray Epps and these others, is the selective non-prosecution when you compare to the shock and awe draconian treatment visited on grandmas taking selfies for trivial offenses. Many people still rotting away in solitary confinement under Abu Ghraib-like, really Geneva violation level conditions here for trivial offenses. And you look at the other side of the coin of major figures like Ray Epps and others who we could get into, who haven't been charged, haven't been searched. There's zero interest in them. And so we cover this in the Revolver.News piece. We show that the FBI is still looking for grandmas who are sitting around. There's one individual that I've taken an interest in. His name is Thomas Caldwell. He's in his 60s. He's a disabled veteran, and thankfully he's finally been let out on bail, but he's spent time in solitary confinement. The government is throwing very serious stacked conspiracy charges at him, and his situation is a scandal unto itself because the core of the government's case against him is using the statements and actions of the founder and head of the Oath Keepers militia group, using someone else's statements and actions as constitutive of the conspiracy in which he was allegedly involved. And yet, this guy, who's a fellow traveler, not even an underling, is hit with conspiracy charges and thrown in prison. And the founder and head of the militia group in question, the Oath Keepers, his name is Stuart Rhodes, remains untouched. He remains unindicted. And the sole extent of the government's interest in him at all was 4 months after January 6th, they took a single cell phone from him, and that's it. So he hasn't even been properly searched.
So there's another egregious case of severe selective prosecution and selective non-prosecution in which the head of the whole militia group, whose actions are the basis of the conspiracy that they're charging this poor guy Thomas Caldwell with, they're not even interested in his full communications record. So again, we see the similar pattern that we see with Ray Epps and others, is that key people who, by the government's own case in many instances, played instrumental, decisive role in making this insurrection happen, are just, they're just walking free, the big fish walking free. Meanwhile, the little fish, the minnows, are rotting away in solitary confinement and hit with very serious stacking charges of conspiracy and worse.
And now, Darren, just to be clear, it doesn't seem like there's any indication that these guys have been arrested and threatened, that you better be available as a witness for the prosecution when these...
So that's it for Lookingglassforum in this particular episode. We'll come back as soon as possible, maybe in 45 days, to bring to you another episode of Lookingglassforum. And of course, a word from our sponsor. So we have a brave, wonderful sponsor with Wendy's Boutique Limited, and you can find that wonderful women's apparel and fine jewelry outlet online at wendyslimited.com. So that's all one word, wendyslimited.com, and there she has wonderful deals, wonderful discounts on all kinds of beautiful gift ideas, or if you love to get lipstick and need a scarf or need some new shoes, go to wendyslimited.com. And that's our word from our sponsor. So thanks again, guys, for joining.